Thank you all for being here tonight. This is Lunder Institute at Crystal Bridges Bite-Sized Conversation. As Crystal Bridges in the Momentary, we recognize our role as settlers and guests in the Northwest Arkansas region. We acknowledge the Caddo, Quapaw, and Osage, as well as the many Indigenous caretakers of this land and water. We appreciate the enduring influence of the vibrant, diverse, and contemporary cultures of Indigenous peoples. We are conscious of the role in colonization that museums have played. As cultural institutions, we have a responsibility to engage in the dismantling of historic and systemic invisibility of Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future. We choose to intentionally hold ourselves accountable to appropriate conversation, representation, connection, and education to facilitate a space of measurable change. Again, welcome to our evening. I'm Mindy Bisa. I'm the Director of Research, Fellowships, and University Partnerships and Curator of American Art. And I can't wait for this night to unfold. About, I don't know, maybe it was a year ago or so, I got a call from Erica Wall, right over here at the Lunder Institute. Good evening, Bentonville! Woo! Okay. And Erica said, would you all like to be part of a national conversation to really think through this idea of what is the state of American art? And I said, yeah, let's bring that party to Bentonville! Woo! Okay, no, just kidding. We'll clap a lot. So to lead this dialogue, I turned to my curatorial colleagues, Alejo Benedetti, Curator of Contemporary Art, right over here, Jen Padgett, Windgate Curator of Craft, and Jordan Poorman Cocker, Curator of Indigenous Art. And I turned to those colleagues and said, okay, this is what we're gonna do. The reason why they are so instrumental to our conversations about American art is that Alejo, Jen, and Jordan are leading the dialogues around what will the American Museum look like in 2026 when we open a big expansion? At that point, you'll be able to see their handiwork. How are we going to frame our collection, our artworks on the walls of this museum? So you'll have to come back in 2026 to see their handiwork. And within that, talking to Alejo, Jen, and Jordan, how should we go about this? And they were like, well, you turn to the experts, the artists. So it's the artists that are going to really lead us in thinking about American art. And that tonight, Alejo, Jen, and Jordan will be joined on stage by Danielle Hatch, Nguyen Lopez, and Kalyn Barnoski. So join me in welcoming them in advance. Thank you all. So on your table, you have a little run of show of how the evening is going to go. In between speakers and conversation, I would encourage you to turn to the people next to you at the table. Tell some stories about art. Tell some stories about Crystal Bridges. Get to know someone that maybe you haven't met before tonight. Now with that, I'm going to turn it over to Erica to say a few words, and we'll get started with the artists. Thank you.
That's like the second time I've slipped today. It's these cute shoes. Okay. First of all, thank you so much, Mindy. And with this mic, of course, I have to say, I love you, Bentonville. Thank you. But in all seriousness, my name is Erica Wall. I am the director of the Lunder Institute for American Art at Colby College and its Museum of Art. And it is such a pleasure. And as folks have said today, we are super excited to be here, but most importantly, we are very grateful to be in conversation and to have you all here to join us today to launch what will be the third of 6 Lunder Institute acts. The Lunder Institute is a think tank. It is a think tank that is part of the Colby Museum of Art, but it serves as a compass for the field, for the practitioners in the field. And it doesn't just direct us towards one North Star, but really helps us to think about the many different directions that we have yet to explore. And so we seek through that exploration the different questions that prompt us to look for more. So to ask the question, as we did of 6 institutions, what is the state of American art? And to Crystal Bridges, it's really asking the question, what is the state of America, regionally, nationally, and globally, and how that is reflected in our discourse, research, scholarship, and art production. And as we know, museums and all art institutions play a critical role in the ongoing exploration and how we share that with the public. So Lunder Institute was created to create a vehicle for institutions to be in conversation with one another for and with the public. And so I want to thank Crystal Bridges for being in conversation with the Lunder Institute. I also want to specifically thank Rod Bigelow, its executive director, as well as the amazing staff of program partners, starting with Mindy Bisa, Taylor Pechtel, participating members of the curatorial staff, who you'll hear from shortly, and the engagement team led by Marissa Reyes, made up of Moira Anderson, Ashley Edwards, Olivia Gutierrez, and Natasha Higgins, for collaborating and designing and implementing what I am confident is going to be a spectacular program. I also want to express my sincere thanks and gratitude to Peter and Paula Lunder and the Lunder Foundation for making the Lunder Institute for American Art possible, and for the many ways in which this unique platform builds communities and benefits not only Colby College and its community, but as we see here today, the discourse and practice of American art throughout the country and beyond. So again, thanks to all of you for joining us and partaking in today's program. And with that, I will hand it off to Alejo and Danielle to kick us off.
All right.
Okay.
Well, here we are. Thank you, everyone. We're gonna kick this off. This is gonna be fun. It's gonna be a fun evening, and I think perhaps the best way to kick off a fun evening is with perhaps a little explanation of what is on people's tables.
Yes, so I'll just give you a quick introduction to the items on your table that you're going to be playing with tonight. What you have there is a sleep mask, but what I'm calling an eye cozy. And so I want to encourage you all to just dive into adding decoration, pattern, color, imagery that you feel connected to your mask. And just as like a point of introduction for why I selected this activity, in my practice, I think about fabric as a narrative material. And so I sort of put myself in your shoes and was recalling artist talks that I've been to in the past at Crystal Bridges, and just, what that's like to come at the end of a long day after working or going to school. You sort of drag yourself here, and I've been to some artist talks where it feels like electricity into your body, like you leave seeing the world in a new way. And then I've been to other artist talks artists whose work I really admire, but who, maybe arrives with a piece of paper and then begins like reading a prepared statement in a monotone voice, and your body just sort of like melts in your chair throughout the evening. So I thought, I don't know where this talk will land on that spectrum for you all, so I thought I would give you this like moment of care, which I associate with fabric, to offer you this eye mask. So I want to encourage you all, when you're done decorating your masks, to put them on, like me and Alejo, and if you start to get tired, you go ahead and lower that mask. Take some time for yourself, relax, enjoy the evening in whatever way feels best to you. And we were joking about just the fact that like we can keep each other honest up here. Like if one of us starts monologuing, the other one can just slowly lower the mask. So yeah, enjoy, have fun, look forward to seeing like the pink masks pop up throughout the evening.
Well, I think this is I think this is also an amazing way to kind of introduce your practice. And on the screen behind us, we'll have some images of Danielle's work that's just kind of moving through. But we're just going to talk more sort of globally about your practice. And I think one of the things that I love that you just said is this idea of fabric as a narrative material. And I think that's such an evocative way to frame this material. And I wonder if you could expand a little bit on that. Like, what do you mean when you say that?
Yeah, I think I'm drawn to fabric because it feels like a common language. It's something that we all engage with daily. We all make choices related to fabric, and it's something that sort of surrounds us in domestic environments, which is also a space that I'm really interested in. And so, yeah, the opportunity to begin to think about what do our fabric choices related to clothing and like home decor, what do they signify or obfuscate? So what are the stories they tell about class, gender, culture, what is communicated through that medium? And yeah, and then where do we feel freedom to sort of express ourselves honestly, and where is it used as a tool for control? And so that's just, yeah, I find those things endlessly fascinating, and I think it is because maybe as a child, that is your point of entry into having some say in your identity, is those choices that you make each day with the clothing that you put on your body.
Yeah, well, and specifically about identity and this idea of sort of adornment and I mean the act that folks are doing right now, adding things to their own mask. But can you talk a little bit more specifically about this idea of adornment and how we sort of create our identity maybe through that act?
Yeah, I think especially recently in my work, it sort of started with an investigation of like the form of the ruffle as this like decorative like motif that I find really endlessly fascinating now. But I think I sort of relate to it as something that feels, or that can often feel like it's additive, like you have these hard structures that you're surrounded by, or these spaces that you sort of want to hide. I think of like the bed skirt. So I'm sort of drawn to this idea of like these tools that we use to like soften the hard structures of our life, or to add beauty to things which can be, painful or difficult, and sort of whose role that is within like culture to add that beauty, to add that care and that softness, and especially as it relates to like the architectural environment, which can be a very cold, hard space, and there's a lot of uniformity there too. And I think one thing that I'm drawn to with decor is like a sense of freedom that can exist within the like sort of DIY homemaker space. This idea of like, I'm gonna cover my chair with this, or I'm gonna put these curtains up. Like, there's a less of a permanence in that space, and so I feel like more expressiveness and like joy can be a little more present in that space. And so that's why I kind of like to pull that out into like a more public sphere, because I think so often it exists in interior environments, and I love to see that sort of expressive, joyful nature sort of seep out into the kind of the broader visual landscape.
Well, I love this because, and well, we're seeing it on the screen right now, but sometimes, if you live in Northwest Arkansas, you drive past a building and it looks like this, and that's Danielle intervening. And I think like the question that I want to ask is like, okay, how does Danielle Hatch see buildings around us? Like, what causes you to say like, oh, this needs to be embellished in some way?
Yeah. So there's a quote by the British painter Lubena Himid where she says, "We live in clothes, we live in buildings, but do they fit us?" And that's sort of like a North Star for me as I kind of experience the built environment. And I find myself always just sort of examining, like, what is my relationship to this building, if any? And so I have a commute in Northwest Arkansas. I drive down Walton Boulevard. I drive through a lot of suburban neighborhoods, and yeah, just find myself like wondering what are my connections to these buildings? Do I feel connected in any way to these spaces? And so I think it really started with like the generosity of a local building owner, Amber Paradin, for basically giving me the space to sort of just experiment and play with her building, which I think, again, gets to this sense of like, who controls the built environment, who owns these spaces, and are there points of entry for people to feel like they can be creative in that space? And so Amber generously gave me that gift to be able to do it once, and then I think once people see that it can exist in the world, then there's it sort of opened up so many more opportunities and possibilities of other people, again, being generous with their space and willing to sort of think broadly about what these collective landscapes, urban landscapes, cityscapes can look like. And I just, that's kind of my great joy, is to like want to like share that sense of like, we can identify with these spaces, we can see ourselves reflected in them, and begin to think creatively about what those look like. So yeah.
Well, and I love also this idea that you talk about being in these spaces and the sort of embodied feeling of being in these spaces. And so it's not just sort of the adornment of the building. It's also oftentimes the adornment of yourself, and you step into the space, also sometimes matching the space, sometimes sort of complementing the space. And I wonder if you could speak to that sort of two-pronged approach to engaging with a space.
For sure, yeah. I see a lot of parallels between, like for me, the female body and in particular the domestic environment. I recently renovated a home over 2 years, and so I don't know if anyone has been through that process, but you find yourself looking at light switches and saying, which of these light switches represents who I am as a person? So many small choices that you make, and you want the space to feel reflective of you in some way, if possible, obviously, within your budget and, time frame, but that just, got me thinking about how deeply embedded we are in the spaces that we inhabit and how they embed themselves in us, that it's that reciprocal back and forth between those spaces. And so I think I began to really think of the domestic environment as a stand-in for the female body in many ways, as a place where we sort of create identity for ourselves. And there's I find a lot of starting points for my work in literature that speaks about the interior lives of women. And there's a great line from Rachel Cusk where she talks about entering a home and feeling like anything that happens in that space will be deeply felt by the woman that lives there, and that this is something that she feels intuitively. And that was something that also kind of resonated with me as someone that had put many hours into the design and nurturing of my home environment. And so that's something that I like to play with, that back and forth between the female body as something that houses people, and then also, just the structures that we create that are a stand-in for ourselves as well.
Well, and something else that's also interesting is, if we are looking at some of the different, well, let's say some of the different colors that you tend to gravitate towards. Just a lot of pink. We're all sort of living proof of this, of the a lot of pink. Tonight, but I think there's also a way in which colors get coded. There's ways in which modes of making get coded, and these are things that obviously are very much part of your practice. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you either lean into that or try to press against it or make that obvious in some way.
Yeah. So I think this is something that's fairly recent, in the last 4 years, that I've really embraced color. And although the colors might speak as something artificial, a lot of them begin with natural flora. So maybe I'm looking at the understory trees in Arkansas and just kind of beginning to see where does nature give us these pops of color, this moment of beauty, which I really connect with this idea of the understory in particular. Like there's these beautiful pawpaw trees, red buds that kind of present themselves in the spring. And yeah, I just really connected with that idea of like being within a larger overstory, that like within that structure, like you can find beauty in these smaller spaces. And so that was a starting point for some of the color choices. Also, Peruvian textiles are another point of entry into these sort of bright colors, which again, maybe read as artificial, but can actually be created through natural dyes. And so it was really just, again, going back to the project that I did at Amber's house, like prior to that, I had kept a pretty muted color palette, and I just felt like this is a public space that I'm engaging with, and I wanted to give people a moment of joy, almost like a visual reprieve from the like mundane beige stucco of the world. Like I wanted an alternative to that, and so that was kind of the beginning, and then it just opened the floodgates of like, where else do I see intense pigmented color in the natural world, and what can I pull from that?
Well, and I love also because we're right now sitting at Crystal Bridges, and we are very much in the Ozark landscape, and yet we are in this very large built environment. And so there's this very interesting play that starts to happen, and it's wonderful to hear you talk about like, okay, these things that may on the surface seem very very artificial, that they also have these very natural roots that come into that. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about very specifically like being in this place, being in Northwest Arkansas, of like sort of of all the different places that you could be. There's something about working in this space that seems informative to your practice, is what I might say.
For sure, yeah. So I moved here with my family about 5 years ago, and we were drawn here by the natural landscape. Like we live in this pastoral valley, and I think my husband and I both thought like, I can die here. Like I can be sitting on a rocking chair looking at this vista and feel good about that. And so, but I didn't come with any sort of thought that this would be like a boon to my art practice per se. But like, I've been so pleasantly surprised to discover that there is a really nurturing community of artists here, and in particular, artists that are open to collaboration. So like tonight, there's a poet that I've worked with on a public art piece. She's a musician. I've worked with just so many individuals that are so generous with their practices and willing to collaborate, and that has like expanded like the scope of possibilities for what I've been able to kind of undertake in my work. And it's been just so lovely to see that like woven in naturally through relationships with other artists and just community members in the space. So I have a huge love for Northwest Arkansas, and just so much gratitude for that sense of generosity and community that I've discovered in this space.
Well, and I know that one of the projects that was very, very much engaged with the community and open to the community and relied on help from different members of the art scene here is one that folks have probably seen sort of scrolling through, and it involves a lot of cake.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could expound upon. Oh yeah, here we go. So perfect.
Yeah, so again, this is like a project that had been sort of percolating in my mind, but like took a local curator who just really gave me a little bit of a blank slate to start with on this project. And I said, well, what about, making 300 pounds of cake and encasing myself in this skirt? I am a mother to 3 children, and just through the early stages of motherhood and art making, really began to kind of confront this like duality of like the joy of giving and the self-erasure that accompanies that, and just felt that really intensely. And so I had this notion of like turning myself into this thing to be consumed, but not in a way that feels destructive per se, or that is not only destructive, but is also like beautiful and generous. And so again, this was not something that could be undertaken individually. So I was so lucky to have, and actually there are some women here who baked cakes for me. Hi, Jocelyn. Yeah, so a group of like volunteer friends, family, that I think probably about 30 to 35 women that collectively helped me bake the cakes for this piece, and then in fact showed up the day of when the sun started shining on my armature and the cake started sliding down the side. And it was just, yeah, it was this moment of like maternal exhaustion, but that like I was surrounded by friends who helped me troubleshoot that, and we were able to pull something together in the end that felt very meaningful. I did embody exhaustion in this piece, but that felt right for what I was talking about at this moment. So, and then again, just inviting community members to like engage with me as I would engage with my children. So really wanting to meet them in a place of generosity and inquisitiveness, but also coming to them with complete exhaustion. So like that commingling again of like, yeah, desire to engage, but just what can one person do? That was definitely completely embedded in that work. But again, so grateful for the women and the volunteers that helped me bring it to life. So,
Well, I cannot possibly imagine a better place to sort of wrap our conversation, which is hard to believe that we're already at that 20-minute mark, but then to sort of leave with that gesture of that incredibly generous gesture of giving yourself, giving your art to this, and being able to also be a space for conversation, be a space for connection.
yeah, and the importance of good dessert, right?
And the importance,
So
which is
let's all
yes, this
enjoy.
is the other.
Yeah.
There are many places to see Danielle's work, but I'm going to do a shameless plug here. The closest place to see Danielle's work is in the galleries at Crystal Bridges right now. It's on view in our black box, one of Danielle's works. Do yourself a favor and go and have a moment with this beautiful, beautiful, beautiful work. Danielle, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Excellent. As the music comes down, and as you continue the activity of making, the busy hands, you can have the same energy and excitement and enthusiasm. But as you hear my voice, you turn to the stage and you see yet another artist and curator. My name is Jen Padgett, and I am the Windgate Curator of Craft here at Crystal Bridges, and it is my pleasure to be in conversation with Linda. Linda, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And I have to say, I'm a little jealous of Danielle, and a way of making that is so easily portable to a setting like this. There's something really beautiful about being somewhere and somebody pulls out a bag of, say, knitting, and they're knitting on the train, or they're able to do embroidery in a setting where it's just on the go. And I'll say, Linda, your chosen material, your medium is a little different, and one that even though we thought about it briefly, we thought, is there any way to have a hands-on activity that might relate to Linda's work? I'll say it was a little tougher. So, Linda, can you tell us a little bit about your work and a little bit about this material that makes it very difficult to translate, say, to a setting where it's portable and also the results are very quick? But tell us a little bit about how you approach your material and maybe what it is about clay, about ceramics that energizes you when you go into the studio.
Yeah, I will say I've made a lot of, these are dust furries in hotel rooms. And then I wrap them up and I tuck them in my carry-on and we'll bring them home. So it is a little bit portable.
I
I
have to take back everything I just said for archival purposes. Listen, we're going to cut that part out because I have never been in a DoubleTree and thought somebody was in here making ceramics.
When you have a deadline, you just... So yeah, these are dust furries, and for those of you that are unfamiliar with the work, they are inspired by everyday abstraction. Basically, the work is really inspired by the way translation and language was in our household growing up. So I am a first-generation American, and my father is Mexican, and my mother is Vietnamese. And we had very little communication in our verbal communication in our household because we all were learning English at the same time. I only speak English, though, just by the way. So I was basically teaching my parents English going through elementary school. So there was a lot of, the interpretation that my mom and descriptions that particularly my mother, always animated everything and gendered all objects around me. So basically it was moments of like, hey Linda, don't put too much toilet paper in the toilet or the toilet's gonna choke. And I'm like, what? And I'm like, oh yeah, it's gonna get clogged. I understand what you're saying. But with that lens of opening up this visual world that all of the animate objects around me are now alive. So I fed little pieces of, I could lift up the carpet in her house and I would feed it tiny pieces of paper. And everything, I had empathy for basically everything around me, and I wanted to know, like, hey, what life have you lived, chair? Like, how many people have sat on you, and are you happy on this stage? I don't know. So I ended up questioning basically everything around me. And for instance, one of the reasons why I love to abstract objects is the way that you can understand what something is, but if you can step back and remove yourself from what you've learned and what we understand a thing to be, and to maybe try to truly see it for what it is. And some of those moments are like kudzu. I've never lived in an area that had kudzu, but the way that it covers and transforms, I know it's invasive, but it's so, the landscape is, it's magical and fantastical.
Very otherworldly.
Yes. So basically, I just kind of try to see things for maybe what they want to be, and try to empathize with the things around me. Clay allows me to make any form. It allows me to manipulate the material to create anything that I want to create, essentially. So I was very drawn to the material that's probably the second reason why I was drawn to the material. The first reason is in undergrad, I questioned a grade I got. And I was like, wait a minute. I did every project in this clay class and nothing blew up in the kiln. I don't understand how do you get a grade? What is a grade in art school?
What's your grade?
I got a B.
Oh, Listen, we're gonna need to send a message to that professor for some clarification now.
Well, so then it became a challenge, essentially. Like, okay, this professor obviously thinks I missed something. So let me take the next class and see if try to learn what I missed. I have no idea what it was. So I was basically hooked on a challenge, essentially, to kind of understand the material, understand why clay, why am I using clay to create sculptures, and it was a very interdisciplinary school. So yeah, I love clay for that reason.
That is amazing. And do you feel like now with clay, this feels like an A? Because with that challenge of this, and if you're trying to get a grade, I feel like ceramics is this space that can be so unpredictable and such a place of surprise, and you both have a lot of control, but maybe have those unexpected things, right?
I'm not gonna lie, I opened a kiln on Monday and I blew up a piece. So I guess I failed.
I was gonna say, yeah, maybe it's pass fail, but it's about the long run. Well, I had never known about that, so I love that insight into what maybe drove you to pursue the material. But when I think about this big picture question that frames the evening and how we think about an individual artist's career overlapping with these larger questions. I was so excited to talk to you tonight because when I think about your career and these moments of connection to what's the story of Crystal Bridges, what's the trajectory of American art here, and see in so many places where your work plays a role in what are really key moments. And one of those that was early in the history of the museum was an exhibition that we had called State of the Art. So State of the Art was all about looking broadly across the country and asking, what are artists making now? What is the work that maybe hasn't been seen by broader audiences or brought together in these ways? So you were one of the artists that was included in that exhibition, which was in 2014, and we've since had another edition of the exhibition in 2020, one that Alejo was a co-curator for. But can you tell me a little bit about your participation in that exhibition and what it meant to you then and maybe the trajectory there?
So I had just moved to Arkansas maybe a year or two before Chad showed up to my home studio for a studio visit. And I didn't have any work. Like everything was like shipped out to exhibitions. I had a solo show up in Philadelphia, and I was a little bit unsure of, actually I think it was probably one of my first museum like curator studio visits. So I had my laptop and we sat on my couch, and I just showed him works of of the current exhibition that was in Philadelphia, that was kind of exploring this narrative of inanimate objects having this kind of inner life and a translation of the everyday. And so, wow, I thought I failed it. I left that studio visit thinking like, okay, well, I'm not gonna get in that show. Okay, that's okay. But as artists, this is kind of a thing that happens. You have no idea what's gonna happen. So participating in that exhibition was amazing. Again, I was very young. I had just been out of graduate school, and I remember pulling up my Subaru to the loading dock and just like taking him out of the back seat and like thinking like, here we go. Like I'm gonna be in this show. This is amazing. So it's been what year was that? 2014.
Yeah,
Wow,
way
it's
back
been
in
10
2014.
years. I would still pull up to the loading dock and take something out of my back seat, I think.
Do the little hand carry just directly in the museum. I would say that's a great benefit of having you in the area too. Not every artist can do that. Another just moment in that history was also around that exhibition. PBS created a documentary about the exhibition and went to the different studios of artists included in the show. And I found this image online, which I just loved. I hadn't seen that in a long time. But it was in this very room that you and I met for the first time, when we had a screening of the documentary here at Crystal Bridges. So do you ever just pop the DVD in your DVD player and revisit? Because I tried to look for it and I realized I didn't have my passport, the Arkansas PBS passport logged in, which if any of you are PBS passport subscribers, you can go watch the documentary and it's really fun. There's great dogs featured in it across the different studios, but have you ever revisited that or remember the process?
I probably blocked it from my memory. I don't remember watching it. I think I maybe watched like a snippet of it, but I think I don't. It's one of those things you don't want to really hear your own voice most of the time, but it does pop up occasionally, like this image on our PBS like screen, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's weird. Like, I'm like, whoa, like that's so strange. And Una's like, hey, there you are, and I'm like, yeah, that's bizarre.
The algorithm is working if they're recommending your own content to you. I think that's a pretty strong sign. They know in your own home.
Yeah, but it was really a special moment to be able to capture that moment of time, and especially like I think my daughter might be in a small snippet of it too. Yeah.
Nice. Well, if anybody needs a watch, I'm going to try to rewatch it soon and get some popcorn and relive. But I wanted to talk also about another moment that was important in the development of the institution too, and something that ties both to our history together and then also to the position that I'm now in, which is all about promoting craft across the institution and then the field, thinking about how we include a wider range of materials and practices and things all around that idea of skilled making. And in 2021, we had an exhibition here that I co-curated with Glenn Adamson, a really wonderful colleague and collaborator. And we included your work within the exhibition then. And I remember so much that studio visit beforehand being such a great moment. So I was wondering about that exhibition, which came at this moment right as the pandemic was both at its height at the end of the planning and then opening at this moment when people were so excited to see these things that have such tactile and lively quality. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your work in that show.
Yeah, so that piece was like a squishy dust furry, I think. So just thinking, so let me just go back a little bit and just tell you where the dust furry came from. So the dust furry was inspired by dust. If you have seen in the like the hardware stores or department stores, the dusters that are like kind of really microfiber-ish, and they have a lot of like so they're inspired by dust. I read this article about a chandelier at a pub in New York City called McSorley's, and at one point, they had a bunch of chicken bones hanging on chandeliers from World War II. And during that time, as people were leaving for the war, they would leave their wishbone on the chandelier, and then they would come back and retrieve their wishbone and make their wish. There were a lot left, and over time, since then, McSorley's, I think maybe in like the mid 2000s, like 2006 or 7, McSorley's, the health department said that they had to remove the wishbones because they were covered in so much dust, which started to basically build like another form, essentially. So that idea of like kudzu and kind of the transformation of space and form. But if you Google the images, they're absolutely beautiful. And one of the really exciting things about dust, to me, was that it encapsulates time. So it captures time, it captures people. I mean, it's like dander of body, right? Like it's, and it's hair, and it's all the things in the space. So it's almost like a little mini time capsule. So what really kind of got me was at the end of the article, McSorley's took all of the dust from the chandeliers and put it in a jar and saved it. And I was like, whoa, like who knew dust could be so precious, right? Like, and beautiful to like capture like a period of time. So for me, like, I was like, okay, like, I need to make some dust. Like, this is cool. So, and that thing of like kind of going back to like the idea of like objects living a life or having empathy towards things, I started to really think about like, nobody cares about dust. Nobody wants dust. So the piece this is a different piece. This is, yeah. Okay.
This is the one that was in Crafting America.
Yes.
That one, this one I think was a squirmy one. So this is squirmy as opposed to squishy.
Yeah. So thinking about the idea of these objects of kind of like making dust beautiful, and kind of this idea that it is coating something underneath but transforming it, the object underneath. So you don't really necessarily know what it is, what's underneath it. It's kind of the time and the accumulation of dust and bringing beauty to something that we kind of find gross, right? Or, yeah.
Yeah, when you described it in those really lovely terms as dander that comes from us and is of our bodies, I think it is a certain perspective that would say there's a beauty in it, but also a little bit of a kind of visceral response almost to that idea of the organic and lively quality of the world around you,
right?
Maybe. I'll say, for a work of yours that has now entered the collection, one that we're so excited to have as part of our permanent collection. That idea of dust and accumulation and the life of the object is something we think about when there are works that are going to be on view. And if there's anybody that's in the museum prep team in the audience, just knowing that regular dusting of the galleries is a very important labor to make sure that there's not a McSorley's level of accumulation that affects the work. But I'll note that when a conservator looked at your work and was making recommendations about care, this is where they would say, oh, don't have it in the sunlight, or if it was a textile. With this, it said, it may accumulate dust, so you might want to keep it under a vitrine to prevent the need for the regular cleaning. So I don't know if you have any, I don't think I had told you that there was a dust warning, but that's something that you've probably heard from other institutions. Just
use those like keyboard dusters, those like air cans.
Amazing. We have just...
I can talk about this piece real quick.
Oh yeah, would you say a word about this that is in the collection?
Yeah, so this piece, this is the squishy that I was thinking of. Thinking about the piece beforehand, which is like just a glazed earthenware piece, the work had evolved over time where I started to really think about color. This is the largest porcelain piece I've ever made and probably will make, because it's really hard to make large-scale porcelain sculptures that won't crack. This piece is pigmented porcelain. It basically has stains that allow the color transition, so there's no glaze on this, so all the color is from the actual clay body itself. And for me, like thinking about color and color transitions, I started to really think about like the light that interacts with the objects, especially in like a domestic space, and how sunsets or sunrises can really change how you see and perceive the things around you. So for me, one of the moments I really love inside of my home, which most of you probably don't love, but thinking about when the sunlight comes in and you can see like the dust kind of floating in space. It's so it's a moment of slowness. It's a moment of calm. It's a moment of like to appreciate like the space around you, but also kind of allowing you to understand like a moment and a passing moment maybe.
I think that's really beautiful, and it connects to that idea about the settings being so important and so fully engaged with the work. And I think that connects nicely to the last thing I wanted to mention before we close our portion of the conversation, which was something that we saw in formation. I came and visited with some interns a summer ago, and it was really wonderful to come see things in the studio. And the work that you were making was connected to this project, which is in a space that is so dynamic and so different than maybe the more controlled gallery setting. But would you say just a word about this project and maybe as a little enticement for people to go see it themselves?
This is my first public art project, and it's a permanent installation at Pinnacle Mountain State Park in Little Rock. So I was commissioned to make 5 bronze pieces and install them into the park off of one of the mountain bike trails. When it first approached me, I was like, I love this idea, because I always, when I imagine my pieces, when I started my work with these furries, they were always with other pieces. I see them as characters, essentially. So I have the dust furry, which is what my daughter is climbing. I have the nubby. This guy that looks like hot dogs is a husky. And I think there are more characters, but I think just in this installation, it's just those 3. But I think about how these things interact and play with space, and what they would do in that space. So when I was approached with the project, I thought, wow, I want this to be fun. I want to start to create that. I want to stand on that threshold of being in reality, but also starting to switch into that abstract world. So I'm super excited to see these in all 4 seasons. Right now, the pieces themselves really stand out because of the saturation of the colors of the objects. But I'm really excited to see them when it's full-on summer, when the objects start to get kind of engulfed into the tall grass and the leaves and the trees. And I want them to start to kind of like live. It's almost like backwards, I was thinking. Like they come out of hibernation in the winter, and then they'll hibernate and kind of hide in the summer. So I'm really excited to see these kind of just like also living on rocks and not like pedestals or concrete pads. So, you know, to me, like thinking about like the interaction and trying to make these seem like they were just hanging out, like they're here, just kind of living.
I love that, and I hope I have a chance to go and see them soon, and just so appreciate you joining for the conversation this evening, and just so happy to have you all here as well. So for the next element of the conversations, we're gonna have a short interlude in which we'll also get to the more literal part of the bite, in which you'll be served a bite of food, and there's a little menu on your table, so you can read the description of the bite there. Back to making, if anyone needs an additional drink, I think the bar is still open. So everyone, thank you so much, and could we just please say thank you for Linda for joining, this is wonderful.
Thank you.
Skoden. Studis Skoden. Hi, everyone. We saved the best for last. I'm just kidding. Everyone's the best here. I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself, and then Kalyn, I'm going to turn the time to you to do a brief introduction, and we'll just jump in.
That sounds great.
So, Deonde Babon, Deonde Batsa, Dom Toyak Oi Maakan, Toy Boga Paddletiga, Bigo Nado, and Maloa Dalava. My name is Jordan Poorman Cocker. I'm the curator of Indigenous art here at Crystal Bridges since September, so fairly new. And I'm so thrilled to welcome Kalyn Fay Barnoski as our guest tonight.
Bueno, thank you so much for having me. So, Sio, Kalyn Fay, Tawado, Chichalagi, Chimaskoke. Hi, my name is Kalyn Fay Barnoski. I'm Cherokee Nation and Muskogee Creek descent. My family is from Bunch, Oklahoma, right outside of Tahlequah. And my family's Bird Clan, and I'm really excited to be here. Yeah, we thought it was important to ground ourselves. That's Native way, you know. We have to let you guys know where we come from so we can figure out a way to connect ourselves from where you guys come from.
Absolutely. And I think maybe that might be a good sort of segue into our topics tonight. So we're talking about the state of American art. And I feel like really recognizing, you know, as we heard at the beginning of our talk from Mindy, that acknowledgement of place and that acknowledgement of Ogakpa, Wajaji, and Caddo relationship to place, and how important it is to hear these languages in our space. So thank you so much for sharing. I kind of want to start off from this point of relationship. So relationship to environment, but also relationship to, of course, your incredible artistic practice. And we know that we don't create art in a vacuum. We know that, you know, we work with mentors, elders, community members to inform not only that artistic practice and growth, but also, you know, decision making around these sort of finer points of the artworks themselves. So I wanted to ask, because I know that you spent time with one of my favorite Cherokee basket makers, Shan Goshorn, if you could talk a little bit about mentorship and a little bit about intellectual genealogy and how that influences your artwork.
I think that's great. I love talking about that. I would talk for 20 whole minutes about Shan. If you don't know who Shan Goshorn is, she is an Eastern Band Cherokee basket weaver. She passed a few years ago, and we're all still very much mourning that, but also existing in the joy and care of the path that she sort of carved out for all of us, which is great. She was one of my mentors. She had this incredible practice of pulling images that were difficult for people sometimes to understand, boarding school images, broken treaties, and she would print them onto like a BFK Reeves rag paper and weave them together into these incredible double-walled baskets. And double-walled baskets are, that practice was very small for a long time. And so the fact that she was able to do that in its contemporary sense really enlivened the practice in many ways for contemporary Cherokee artists. But something that pretty much changed my entire practice and the way in which I make right now was something she said about her baskets, and something I share all of the time. It's an anecdote that I will probably share forever, which is someone, asked her why she made these baskets that had these difficult images and these, difficult knowledges for people who come from outside of the culture. And why these, it not only is on the outside of it, it's on the inside of the basket as well. And she said it's easier to receive a hard message when you've already leaned into something. And that is why I make the work I make now. It's, my work is about empathy. It's about trying to interweave stories and understandings in my relationships with other people, not just within my own tribal nation, but intertribally, and finding that joy in the practice, and helping people lean into these messages or understandings that they might not be akin to, they might not know, but I want to offer that space for them to engage.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I first saw an interview of Shan Goshorn when I was working at the Gilcrease back in 2020. They had this beautiful retrospective of her work on view, and there was an interview by Sterling Herjo that sort of encapsulates exactly that moment, and it's something that also profoundly impacted me. And the quote was very similar. It was, why do you make baskets the way you do? And she responded, some of these topics around U.S. history, around, the degradation of colonialism and the impact are so heavy. And she said, baskets are these domestic forms. They're these beautiful feminine forms. And there's this moment when people encounter that work where they lean in. And she said that space between the basket and the viewer at that moment is a space of learning. And I thought that was so beautiful. And so I'm so glad you shared that, because it's something that I think about often. And I think, as Indigenous artists, but also as curators, you're the curator of Native art at Philbrook right now, you're holding it down in Tulsa. There's so much depth and meaning to these art forms that I think is distinct from other areas of the art world. Hrog Vartanian, who writes for Hyperallergenic, observed that Native artists don't create necessarily only for, opulence or frivolity, but sometimes we do. But often Native artists are creating for survival as a means to make that meaning. And this is something that I feel that your work interrogates very deeply, not only your artwork, but also your curatorial work, as well as your music. So just sort of mapping back to these moments of learning and these moments of teaching, I know that through your music, you incorporate Chalagi language and concepts. And I've had the privilege of listening to you live, which is a gift to the world. If you ever have the chance to listen to Kalyn Fay sing, it's amazing. Highly recommended. You have a show this weekend coming up.
I do. I'm playing at South by Southwest tomorrow. I get to drive to Austin.
But can you talk a little bit about that influence of language, aesthetically and text, and then also spoken?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that interest in language began because my father is the youngest of 10 kids. And both my grandparents and my, earlier aunts and uncles are first language speakers. And my grandpa actually never learned how to write or read in English. It was like this active resistance for him to not learn English and retain that. But by the time it got to my dad, he did not learn the language. And he still knows a few things here and there, but by the time it came to me, I wanted to reclaim that for my dad, to create an idea of what it means to be successful outside of these like Eurocentric spaces, and what it means to be able to support in a community and in a family space. And for me, that means, trying to reclaim that language for our family, trying to speak with my aunts and uncles in Cherokee as much as I can, so that they know, their knowledge is valued, not just with that generation, but with me as well, and my sister and my direct family as too. But when things really turned was I was in undergrad, and I developed a new typeface for the Cherokee Nation. Okay. And they used it for the design and marketing team for a long time, and that kind of flipped the switch on what language and forms mean. And I continued that practice of exploring language and what it looks like, and then trying to figure out what language means as it sounds too, not just from what we know, but what is reflected in that language and what knowledge is. Because as we know, language is, our cultures are deeply embedded in language and a way of understanding the world. And I wanted to make sure I was, I didn't want to speak ever from a Cherokee perspective unless I knew some type of language within the Cherokee Nation. And being able to speak Cherokee just flips your brain, because you're thinking about your relationship to land, you're thinking about your relationship to community, you're thinking about your relationship to water, what exists above, what exists below, where you are right now. All of those things are influenced and embedded within that language. And so that you can see that in some of my artworks too. It's like trying to reclaim something, trying to relearn something, trying to take ownership of something in a personal perspective, so that I'm able to continue sharing that into the future.
Thank you. And I feel like that moment of revitalization, or that moment where culture, language, art forms like basket making are reborn in a generation, are so integral to the survival and resilience of not only ourselves as Native people, but also our precious inherited art forms and knowledge systems that are attached to them. I guess I'm curious about, your work with Indigenous futurisms. I know in museums we encounter these colonial structures that are deeply entrenched in historicizing Native art and people. And, I think something that we share is this interest in really complicating or re-looking at the ways that time is known and understood, especially as it relates to Native art, because we're very much people of the present as well as the future. So I know that you're working on an incredible initiative right now with some amazing folks in Oklahoma around sovereignty and sovereign futures. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that value of time and why that sort of concept is so important to your work.
Yeah. Oh gosh, time is like...
In 8 minutes. No. 4. No, I'm just kidding.
Time is... Oh yeah, it is integral to the work that I make, because I'm thinking about the investment of time within my practice. I'm thinking about investment of time with community and your relationships and what that looks like, and how we can visualize that, and how we can create like sonic landscapes with that as well. The work that Jordan's referencing is a will be a triennial that happens in Tulsa alongside the Greenwood District. I don't know if many of you know about that space, but there was the Tulsa Race Massacre that happened in the Greenwood District, and so this is initiatives coming through the University of Tulsa, and we are working to create this triennial or symposium in which different spaces are activated for, the Black diaspora, the Indigenous diaspora, and creating these new sites of significance for ourselves in which we have a shared moment, a shared location to point to.
Thank you. And I think this sort of maps back to this larger, very fluid question around American art and what it means and how to define it and how to sort of find those access points into it. But I want to thank you for coming here tonight and sharing about your incredible artwork, as well as a little bit of your curatorial practice, because I know it takes brave and empathetic artists and curators to do this work. And I very much see, these through lines around not only the outputs of the artworks themselves, but the ways that these conversations are inspired by art. And so I'm so grateful to you, Kalyn. I know we're out of time, and I feel like I could be here for another hour, but there's a dinner afterwards.
I will say one thing, too. Yeah. Jordan's also an incredible artist in so many ways, and I feel like I would be remiss without mentioning that. I feel like, in this space and institutional spaces, we feel the need to be one thing, and that's what makes us successful, and that's what makes us attractive to these spaces. But when reality, we are many things. We are sisters, we are aunties, we are artists, we're musicians, we're songkeepers, we're storytellers. And to forget, or to take us out of those things is to remove so much of us. So I hope that when you're engaging with art and when you're engaging with the American art perspective, it's not in a vacuum, like we just said at the first of this conversation, but it's in fact influenced by all of these different parts of ourselves, and without honoring those parts of ourselves, it's hard to have a true experience with our artworks.
Thank you. Oh my God. Kalyn Fay, everyone. On that incredibly inspiring note, I want to say thank you to everyone who came to our event tonight. Thank you to the Lunder Institute and the leadership at Crystal Bridges for believing in this discourse and these conversations. Please don't feel rushed to finish painting your mask. Please stay a while, converse, and enjoy your evening.